What's happening actually in Hormuz is a manifestation of multiplicative cascade that is different from linear logic of cause-effect developments. China has successfully actually diversified in the case of a possible blockade of the strait through partners such as, for example, Pakistan or Myanmar. Trump administration was able to push away the Chinese presence in the Panama Canal, but let's be clear, let's be realistic actually, that it's not possible to have full 100% control and presence in any of these straits. We do not want to be caught in a bifurcating global system. We do not want to face only two choices, either joining United States or joining China.
Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national television channel, Doordarshan, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and important developments in key countries and regions around the world that have an impact on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are looking closely at a nagging problem that has become a huge global crisis today. This is threats to maritime choke points. There are these very, very strategically vital locations connecting to waterways and to freedom of navigation and sea lanes. And these points are now under severe pressure due to geopolitical competition, wars, conflict, and violent actors. So what is it about these maritime choke points that has made them so vital to geopolitics today? And what are the solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems posed by the threats to these maritime choke points? This is the theme of the show. And to discuss this, I'm very privileged to introduce you to one of the leading geopolitical strategists and commentators of the world, Velina Tchakarova. Velina Tchakarova writes and talks extensively on these matters and is a highly sought-after expert and guru. So it's great to have you back on Indian Diplomacy, Velina. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a very big pleasure to talk about geopolitics with the Indian moderator and for the Indian audience.
Thank you so much, Velina. So let's kickstart by taking a look at the big picture. Why do you think these maritime choke points have become bones of contention and conflict and even violence and warfare today? I mean, even 5 or 10 years ago, we just assumed that these were all open and that cooperation is going to continue and that, global navigation and commerce are all going to be hunky-dory, but it's not happening anymore. And you're finding that the choke points are literally getting choked. And we'd like you to start with a general your reading of the global situation as to why these vital locations in the maritime highways have become so contested, and what does it tell you about what kind of world we are in?
That is, of course, a very important question. And right now, if you go on social media, if you read the newspapers, you clearly see everywhere that it's about choke points. Choke points are back at the center of geopolitics. But in reality, maritime choke points never disappeared from geopolitics. So what actually disappeared is more or less the order that kept them relatively stable over the last 20 to 30 years, which was the period after the Cold War, where one naval power basically guaranteed the freedom of navigation through every critical waterway on this planet. And this naval power was the United States. Now, this era is obviously over. And what we are witnessing right now is a structural feature of global system bifurcation. We've been talking about global system bifurcation on your show before. That is now the transition towards new Cold War between United States on the one hand and China and Russia as a modus operandi of strategic coordination on the other. And right now what we are also witnessing, and I will be explaining this to you, is the weaponization of geography, the weaponization of commodities, or if you wish, the weaponization of geopolitical and geoeconomic leverage So basically, we are currently on the brink of a global system rupture. That is the fourth systemic risk-driven crisis after the 2008 financial crash, after COVID-19 in 2020, and after Russia's full-fledged war on Ukraine in 2022. 2026 is now basically the year where we are witnessing the weaponization, the most vital choke point in the world. That is, of course, an unanticipated outcome of the war that United States and Israel started on Iran on 28th of February this year. And in that sense, of course, I can wrap it up for you in the following, let's say, in the following summary when it comes to the structural drivers. First, why it's so critical? Why is it global system rupture? Well, Hormuz is not just any choke point on the map. It has basically facilitated roughly 1/4 of all the seaborne oil and about 1/5 of the global LNG transit up to 27th of February 2026. And around half of the whole world trade was also passing through, this choke point.
I think the bigger point you made about the lack of a guarantor for seaborne trade and commerce today, like a global guarantor like the US. In fact, the US itself seems to be contributing to the crisis that we are seeing now with Hormuz. So let's go to the Strait of Hormuz. Like you said, it's now the cynosure of all eyes. In fact, I think people like you have been poring over maps forever because that's your, core profession. But there are lots of lay people. Everybody is looking at maps and trying to figure out, what is where and how are the routes structured, what are the natural formations. So let's focus on Hormuz. And, right now there's a so-called double blockade, a de facto double blockade where the Iran, has stopped passage for many commercial vehicles. And then the United States is also stopping passage to Iranian ports via the same area. So we have, traffic has come to a trickle. So these big numbers you mentioned, the economy is now effectively held hostage by the rivalry between these two players. So really the question is, what is your reading of the situation? How can we come out of this crisis of the, effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz?
And what's happening actually in Hormuz is a manifestation of multiplicative cascade that is different from linear logic of cause-effect developments. And right now, people think it's only about the oil that's being blocked, and you rightfully pointed out it's a double blockade because on the one hand, Iran, being in a survival mode, actually blocked the strait by threatening to shoot at every commercial ship or tanker. And this started pretty early at the first stage of the war, basically already on the 2nd of March. It's also moving from oil and gas towards next cascades, which are products that are derived from the oil and gas, such as petrochemicals, such as oil products, such as gas products, such as fertilizers, which are pretty important exactly for this region, for South Asia, for Southeast Asia, but also for other parts of the world. It's going to move into the next cascade, such as food commodities. It's going to also affect, and so this also happening, and is again the criticality of the choke point, that Iran was able also to threaten water desalination facilities. He was able to threaten nuclear power plants and so on and so forth. So these cascades, they are moving across various networks. And of course, this is the systemic nature of the threat right now. So this also gives you immediately the answer why nobody, not even United States, on their own are able to provide for a sustainable solution of allocation crisis. This is not just crisis. Of course, there are some discussions right now, such as, for instance, to come up with some sort of regional maritime security compact. Remember in the past when important choke points were threatened, there was a collective effort, for instance, against piracy. This is how, for instance, the military base in Djibouti emerged back in decades where there was a collective interest on behalf of United States, China, European, and Asian partners to act together against the threat. Right now, there is no collective interest because on the one hand, actually is facilitating its own supply chains in the Western Hemisphere, as well as are meanwhile global combined oil and gas exporter. So they are not directly hit, and China on its own has also managed to facilitate its own supply chain, its let's say network of supply. For instance, in this case, it has also managed to build the largest strategic reserve for oil. So it has been more or less on the safe side short term. And, of course, a critical player here being also Russia through the Dragon Bear modus operandi. So you clearly see that the main players at the top of the global system right now, being United States, China, and Russia, are not really inclined to collaborate in order to solve the problem. If you move to the second layer of players, the so-called middle powers, of course they are hard hit on the one side, and that means that it translates also into a direct interest to do something against it, such as multinational escort or creating diplomatic and economic incentives for Iran to, let's say, open the strait. But none of these initiatives are credible enough. Why? Because of the missing security guarantees right now. And the missing security guarantees can come only from the global players. So again, I argue that, that it will be a chain of diplomatic and political solution. And then in the next step, of course, middle powers will have to step in and try to provide, some sort of legal, diplomatic, naval format to actually bring back the freedom of navigation in this particular choke point.
Right.
And of course,
no easy. Yeah, I mean, it's a big conundrum how to get Hormuz reopened, and there are no easy answers. Viewers, what Velina Tchakarova is saying is that, different players have got different stakes and capabilities and leverage over the situation, and there are no simple solutions. I want to go a little away from, West Asia or Middle East towards the Southeast Asian region. Now, there, of course, there's another big choke point, and there is also the Lombok and the Sunda, and there are, three straits there between Malaysia and Indonesia. And those have also, they carry a lot of seaborne commerce between the Western world and Asia. And there has been, heightening geopolitical rivalry between China and the US especially, less so the regional actor. Like, there is no Iran type of actor there. I mean, Indonesia apparently suggested that we should also collect a toll tax from commercial vessels passing through the Strait of Malacca, but that was not really a serious proposition. But what I'm saying is that this here is a classic great power rivalry that you study, and it's in full bloom there. And unfortunately, what that means is the Strait of Malacca could also potentially, who knows, may face a Hormuz-like moment if there is war over Taiwan or something like that. So, and India also, interestingly, has got major naval assets and aerial assets in the Andaman Sea, right next door to the Strait of Malacca. And there is some degree of coordination between India and the US and the other Quad partners to keep China under check there. And Malacca often is seen as the dilemma or as a weakness of China, because all its oil comes through that strait. So let's talk a bit about this region and the locking of horns between China and the US.
Yes, this is of course a major topic because it links directly to China and China's strategic ambitions, not only in the region, in the whole Indo-Pacific region, but actually in the world. And it's not coincidental that the term Malacca dilemma has been actually coined 2 decades ago. Was coined 2 decades ago, namely to kind of point to the strategic anxieties of China when it comes to supply of critically important commodities. Yes, of course, we know that this choke point is critically important, not only for China, but for global trade when it comes to oil and gas transit. But also it's critically important to the countries which are actually directly bordering the Strait of Malacca. This is the case with Indonesia. This is the case with Malaysia. These are countries
Singapore,
that have already, Singapore, they have already made statements regarding Malacca. It's not in their interest to actually close the strait. So it's not just China's problem, it's a problem also of bordering states to actually make sure that the flow of goods and commodities is secure. No regional actor has currently the incentive, but also the capability to unilaterally threaten this strait, the way how Iran has threatened and blocked the Strait of Hormuz. I think this is the good news, but there are, of course, spillover risks. For example, major US-China conflict over Taiwan in the case of military attack of China on Taiwan, or if you wish, in the case of militarization of the region. So there are such risks which might lead to some sort of a blockage of the strait. Currently, it is regarded as a black swan event, so that means improbable event. But then again, of course, we were also discussing the closure of Hormuz as a black swan kind of event that is highly improbable and has, significant impact for global trade. Now, important, of course, point here is that the ASEAN littoral states have strong interest in neutrality. So situation in this part of the world is a little bit different in terms of this new Cold War between the two main systemic rivals, because they are highly interconnected in the network of global trade and economy. And with the regional trade and economy. So that's one important point. Second important point is that China has successfully actually diversified in the case of a possible blockade of the strait through partners such as, for example, Pakistan or Myanmar, but also through terrestrial connectivity that has been built up via the Belt and Road Initiative. And India has, of course, a very, very critical role to play here. Its growing naval presence, its infrastructure on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. It has a network of partners, Indo-Pacific partners. It has built bridges with both worlds by stabilizing relationship with China, deepening the strategic partnership with Russia, and building up the mostly economic relationship with and security, I would say, to a certain extent, with United States. So in that case, I think the Hormuz is also a good example right now to kind of prevent worst case scenario in Malacca. And in that sense, I argue that there is an awareness. Every regional player is trying to diversify, to create hedge plan, to kind of build up relationships with other critically important partners. But in the end, of course, if we, let's assume the worst case, if we would witness a blockade of Malacca and, maybe even Strait of Hormuz for whatever reasons, mostly because of probably some sort of military related.
That would be the end of the global economy as we know it if both these things happen.
This would, the estimations point to 8 to 10% of global GDP loss.
Taking a hit.
Nobody
terrible.
will gain from this.
Viewers, Velina Tchakarova is saying, so far sensible heads are there in East Asia, and it hasn't gone the way of Hormuz, but who knows if there is war. And she mentioned the black swan. Nowadays, you know, the improbable or unthinkable events are happening. So it's an era of war and conflict. So we have to be really watchful and mindful about the security of the Strait of Malacca. Last but not least, Velina, let's go to the Western Hemisphere. We have this tiny little, passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific called the Panama Canal. And here you also find intense rivalry between China and the US. Chinese economic investments, they have stretched the Belt and Road Initiative all the way up to Latin America. They have taken control of ports and many things in that region. And then, especially under Donald Trump administration, there has been a big pushback to try and, shake the region of any Chinese shadow. And we saw that new Cold War in full display over the question of who controls the Panama Canal. So what do you see happening there in that part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere?
We clearly are seeing the example of great power rivalry. And it started with the revival of Monroe Doctrine. It started actually in Panama and moved to Venezuela. These were like the first geopolitical puzzle pieces that exemplified this new transitionary period of international relations, where the United States are withdrawing from let's say, global control and securitization of choke points and of world commerce. And basically of being the global policeman for what they have basically established over the last 20, 30 years. And Panama Canal is this only choke point we are discussing today where one particular great power has deep historical ownership and treaty-backed interests. So it was very important for Trump administration 2.0 to reestablish this control after China has successfully created new geoeconomic facts on the ground, has successfully penetrated through commerce interests and through initiatives within the Belt and Road Initiative, the let's say semi-control over Panama Canal. This is now a past because the Trump administration was able to push away the Chinese presence in the Panama Canal. But let's be clear, let's be realistic, actually, that it's not possible to have full 100% control and presence in any of these straits. So once again, we are facing the same dilemma of global power competition, which is that yes, China still has remaining, so China has a lot of leverage, especially on the geoeconomic terrain. China, even now after the US has been able to prevent overt Chinese strategic control over the ports, the critical infrastructure there in Panama and over the canal. Basically the situation as such is that there was an important signal being sent to China in geopolitical terms. But going back to reality of geoeconomics, and that is, basically the ability to produce cheaply, the ability to immerse yourself into various trade networks. That is, of course, strength, and China
and even the ability to give loans and build infrastructure in all these developing countries, right? I mean, the US cannot compete with China there.
Of course. So that means that, yes, US is using the military muscle, US is using the coercion principle right now. And short term, we can say for 2026 up to the timing of the show, there is now a kind of a shift. But at the same time, China still remains one of Panama's principal trade partners and actually a major canal user, because again, here it is about control over Asia, Europe.
So it's a full spectrum problem. And in fact, it's not a purely military one, viewers. So that's what Velina Tchakarova is saying. Velina, last word, a small country like Panama, or let's say an Oman, or let's say, a Brunei, I mean, or a Sri Lanka. I mean, they are all caught in the crossfire, it seems. I mean, we spoke about great powers and middle power, but the smallest players, they're all frustrated and hand-wringing, and they're saying we must respect international law, UNCLOS, the law of the sea should be upheld. But they're all giving, these moral slogans which seem to be falling on deaf ears. The kind of world we are living in, is it just going to be law of the jungle? Or can we restore some kind of a, regional peace and order and security where these choke points will be free for all, especially the weakest, Briefly, please.
Yes, that's a really important question. It's an existential question given the transformation of the international relations. And I argue that there will be a lot of block building, a lot of realignment, where countries, especially smaller countries, those that are really located at critical choke points or have, due to fate of geography, special leverage because they have raw materials or rare earths or important important for this global power competition, they will probably have to face a kind of tough choice. Are they going to side with the one or other bloc, or are they going to try to maybe also join some bigger regional formats of countries right now? This is a big question. Will there be a third way of regional players coming together, strengthening, for instance, legal norms? You mentioned already the regional codification of norms such as UNCLOS. So this could be a third way, or they could, for instance, kind of strengthen formats, diplomatic, political ones, but also geo-economic ones, where they say we do not want to be, caught in a bifurcating global system. We do not want to face only two choices, either joining United States or joining China. Yeah. And this kind of multi-pillar balancing, I think this is now very interesting.
It's such a deja vu moment, isn't it, Velina, that, during the original Cold War, all the developing countries, we grouped together under the idea of non-alignment. And now, the way this new Cold War is being fought at our expense, where they're taking the maritime choke points hostage. Maybe that time has to come again. I'm afraid I'm out of time altogether, but let me thank Velina Tchakarova, always sharpest, observations and new coinages and concepts. We will continue following you. Viewers, this is, a different era from what was there even 10 years ago, and do follow Velina Tchakarova to understand these contemporary changes. Thank you so much, Velina, for being on the show.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Viewers, maritime choke points are under immense pressure. And as we just discussed with Velina Tchakarova, the choices are not pretty. And the moral, ideal, and the legal arguments are there. Most of us in the developing world are making them, but they're not necessarily cutting much ice. So the era of fierce geopolitics and war and conflict and disregard for norms of civilized conduct, you can see that in front of your eyes. So it's a much harsher and much less civilized world that we are living in, which means all these important geographical choke points that we spoke about today will continue to become, objects of great rivalry, contention, turmoil, and uncertainty and unpredictability. So we have to prepare for this. Maybe there is time to form another block of countries, or at least at the regional level, to secure our sea lanes of communication, especially for middle and small powers. That seems to be the only way forward as far as all the others are concerned. The big players seem to be on a different planet and are pursuing a much more vicious and violent agenda, which is not good for the world. I'm afraid I don't have good news on this front, but India will continue to stand for the moral and the legal principles which underlie the idea of freedom of navigation. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.